I recently sat across from a hedge fund manager who described himself as a green visionary. You'd expect a guy like this to be talking about the ethics of reforestation or the beauty of a carbon-free future. Instead, he was leaning over his drink, eyes darting with a quiet, hungry intensity, showing me a heat map of the Florida coastline on his iPad. He wasn't looking at it with concern, he was looking at it like a gambler looks at a deck of cards. "This," he whispered, pointing to a high-risk flood zone, "is where the real yield is." He wasn't selling solar panels, he was selling catastrophe bonds. To him, a hurricane wasn't a tragedy, it was a balance sheet event. He explained how his firm had shifted from traditional tech into carbon credits, treating CO2 like it was gold or oil. He talked about China's 80% grip on battery refining, not as a geopolitical threat, but as the blueprint for the next century of global dominance. He looked at the smoke from a forest fire and didn't see a dying ecosystem. He saw a tradable asset. The most jarring part was when I asked if he felt a sense of responsibility for the crisis he was betting on. He just gave me this detached, observational smile and said, "We aren't the ones burning the house down. We're just the ones who figured out how to charge for the oxygen." That instantaneous shift from the moral language of saving the planet to the cold logic of monetizing the panic was chilling. It left me wondering, while we've been busy debating whether the climate crisis is real, has the market already turned the end of the world into its most profitable product? Behind the ESG labels and the green stimulus packages, a much older game is being played, one where energy, power, and the rise of empires are being reshuffled in a trillion-dollar casino. Okay, so let's unpack this. That story, it really sets the stage for what we're getting into today.
It really does. It's chilling.
The mission for this deep dive is, I think, to look past all that rhetoric of saving the planet and really examine the cold, hard economic reality of it. You know, how this whole crisis is being monetized.
And how that monetization is radically reshaping the hierarchy of global industrial power. It's not just about money, it's about control.
Exactly. We're looking at two fundamentally parallel narratives here. On one hand, you have this incredibly sophisticated world of financial speculation.
The casino, as you put it.
The casino. And on the other, an absolute, almost brute force commitment to physical, tangible, industrial power.
And what's so fascinating is that these aren't separate stories. They are two sides of the same coin. The global response to climate change is manifesting as both this high-stakes financial game and this intense geopolitical race for control over physical assets.
So that's the duality we need to analyze.
That's it. We need to look at, first, the mechanisms the financial sector is using to bet on disaster. And second, the systematic, incredibly focused effort by one major nation to consolidate control over the material inputs, the infrastructure, the guts of the new energy system.
This isn't just a story about technology, then?
No, not at all. It's a detailed look at how control over scarcity is defining the next 100 years of global power.
Okay, let's start with the financial side, with the casino. I think we need some historical context because you can't really understand this pivot without seeing the foundational link between energy and empire.
It's the essential truth we pull from history, isn't it? Every major shift in global power has been tied to what the dominant power burns.
Right. Take the 19th century.
It was the British Empire, built squarely on coal. I mean, by 1850, the UK was producing more coal than every other nation on Earth combined. This wasn't just fuel to keep warm.
No, it was the engine of everything.
It was the engine of the factory system, their naval power, global commerce. The ability to harness that incredibly dense energy source. That was the very definition of 19th century geopolitical strength.
And then, of course, oil defined the American century.
The 20th century, absolutely. American global influence, from Rockefeller and Standard Oil to the rise of the automobile and suburbia, it all rested on controlling the flow of petroleum.
The creation of OPEC, the wars fought in the Middle East.
It all traces back to who controls the wellhead. So the core implication here, the reason this history matters, is that the very source of energy that built these empires is now threatening them. It's forcing this unprecedented economic and industrial reshuffle.
So the climate crisis isn't just some environmental threat, it's a fundamental shift in the control mechanism of the whole global economy.
Precisely. For decades, pollution was just an externality, a cost that didn't show up on a company's balance sheet. But when governments finally had to respond in the late 1990s with the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, they had a choice.
Ban it or price it.
Exactly. Yeah. Ban pollution outright, which would cripple industrial output or introduce a market solution to control it. They chose to price it.
And that single decision to price it is what gave birth to carbon markets. This is the mechanism that turns emissions into financial assets.
It is. The architecture is based on what's called cap and trade. It's actually quite simple in theory. Governments set a total limit on allowable carbon emissions for a country or a region.
Like a budget.
Like a carbon budget. Then they issue carbon credits, basically the permits to emit CO2 to corporations. Now, if a company is efficient and emits less than its quota, it has unused credits.
And it can sell those credits to a company that pollutes more.
That's the trade. It allows the capital markets to set the price of pollution. On paper, it's designed to incentivize efficiency. In practice, it turned pollution into a highly liquid, tradable financial asset, like gold or oil.
The big test case for this, the major precedent, was the European Union's emissions trading system, the ETS. That launched back in 2005.
And the ETS is now, by far, the world's largest and most important carbon market. The trades it handles exceed $1 trillion a year. It really set the template for the rest of the world.
And it was framed as this elegant solution, right? Capitalism saving the planet.
That was the narrative. But what the sources we've looked at suggest is that while it absolutely succeeded in creating a massive financial market, the actual relationship between carbon pricing and, real verifiable deep emissions reduction, that's been a lot more complicated.
Okay, so let's dig into that. How this market actually functions for corporations. Let's call it speculation on salvation.
A good name for it.
So let's say I run a major industrial firm, an airline, a cement manufacturer, something that emits a lot of CO2. My budget is 800,000 tons, but I emit 1 million tons. I can't just overhaul my entire infrastructure overnight.
No, that would be prohibitively expensive.
Yeah.
So instead, you enter the market. And this is the key financial loop. You buy credits for those extra 200,000 tons from what's called an offset project.
An offset project. So a scheme somewhere else in the world that claims to be reducing or capturing an equivalent amount of carbon.
Exactly. This could be anything from funding a new solar farm in a developing nation to, much more controversially, paying for a rainforest preservation program in the global south.
So you're basically paying someone else to clean up your mess.
In theory. This allows you to maintain your operations, hit your targets on paper, and satisfy investors. For major polluters, pollution becomes a highly managed, outsourced financial liability.
And the material we've been looking at is, well, it's pretty critical of this model. It talks about the porosity of the system. We're sold this image of lush new forests, but the reality behind the value of these offsets can be shaky.
Very shaky. The financial volume just grew so much faster than the regulatory rigor. The fundamental flaws really boil down to 3 main concepts: additionality, permanence, and leakage.
Okay, let's take those one by one. Additionality.
Additionality means that the carbon-reducing project would not have happened without the funding from the carbon credit. But numerous investigations have shown that companies were paying to protect land that was already under protection.
So they were paying for something that was going to happen anyway?
Correct. Or they were funding renewable projects that were already economically viable on their own. The money wasn't adding anything new.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the second one, permanence?
Permanence is crucial, especially for these forestry offsets. If you plant a forest to offset your carbon emissions today, that carbon capture is only permanent if that forest lasts for, say, a century.
But what if it burns down?
Exactly. What if it burns down in a climate change-fueled wildfire 20 years from now, which is happening more and more? All that captured carbon is instantly released back into the atmosphere. The offset is gone.
There was one investigation in 2023, I think, that found over 90% of offsets from a major certifier for rainforest projects were essentially worthless.
It's a staggering figure. And it was because of things like inflated baselines and non-additionality. But the trades continued. They had to.
Because the illusion was what mattered. The illusion of environmental benefit was crucial for these big corporations, the airlines, the oil majors, the tech giants, to maintain their operations and, importantly, to keep a green narrative for their investors.
Precisely. The system, in many cases, became a license to pollute. The financial market was betting on salvation, but the physical reality on the ground often remained unchanged. Billions of dollars were circulating annually based on what was fundamentally flawed environmental accounting.
It really shows that for the market, the primary goal wasn't necessarily mitigation.
It was the creation of a new, high-yield asset class linked to environmental compliance.
So if carbon markets were about pricing pollution, the next logical step for the market was to price disaster itself. This is where it gets...
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. We have to talk about catastrophe bonds. This represents the financial system adapting to the undeniable physical reality of climate change impacts. Think about it from the perspective of a traditional insurance company. They were facing massive, escalating risks,
Wildfires, major hurricanes, severe floods.
unprecedented levels of risk. They couldn't just keep absorbing these losses without going bankrupt, and they couldn't just keep raising premiums forever in high-risk zones like coastal Florida or California. They needed to offload that risk.
And they offloaded it to the global capital market using the Catastrophe Bond, or CES bean. It sounds cynical because, well, investors are literally getting on whether the worst-case climate scenarios happen or not.
It is the financial commodification of catastrophic risk. The mechanism is fascinating. Here's how it works. An investor, say a hedge fund or a pension fund, buys the bond. The insurance company, the issuer, then holds that capital as collateral.
And the investor gets paid for taking on that risk.
Yes, they receive very high, regular interest payments. That's the lure.
Yeah.
But the catch is the trigger mechanism. The bonds contract predefines a specific catastrophic event. It could be a Category 4 hurricane making landfall in a specific county in Florida.
Or total insured losses from wildfires in California exceeding, say, $5 billion in a single year.
Exactly. And if that trigger event occurs,
The investor loses everything.
they lose their entire principal. The insurance company keeps that money to cover the claims from the disaster. This is why the yield is so attractive. It's compensation for the very real chance of a total loss.
There are different kinds of triggers too, right? It's not always about the final dollar amount of damage.
That's right. The most straightforward is an indemnity trigger, based on the insurer's actual losses. But there are others. A parametric bond is much simpler. It might trigger just based on physical parameters, say a hurricane's wind speed hitting 140 miles per hour in a specific location, measured by an official agency.
Regardless of how much damage it actually does.
Regardless, if the wind hits the number, the bond pays out. Or rather, the investor loses their money. There are also modeled loss bonds, which trigger when complex computer models calculate that losses have exceeded a certain threshold.
So that hedge fund manager I met, he saw that high-risk flood zone, not with concern, but as a source of yield. The worse the climate forecast gets, the more volatile the world becomes.
The higher the interest payments have to be to attract investors, and the bigger the market itself grows.
It's a perfect, perverse irony. Climate chaos is the engine of profit for this market.
And it has grown enormously. By 2023, the global CAT bond market had blown past $40 billion. And it's attracting huge institutional investors like pension funds because it offers an asset that is non-correlated to the stock market.
What does that mean, non-correlated?
It means hurricanes and stock prices don't necessarily move together. A bad day on Wall Street doesn't cause a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. So for a big fund, CATLA bonds are a unique diversification tool, whatever you think of the ethics. Catastrophe risk has been successfully packaged and sold as an indispensable financial product.
So alongside pricing pollution and pricing disaster, the financial world needed a public-facing way to manage this new reality. And that brings us to the ESG branding game.
Yes, ESG, environmental, social, and governance. This concept gained massive traction after the 2008 financial crisis. It was, in many ways, an offer of a moral redemption arc for the investment world.
The idea was simple. Put your money where your morals are.
Exactly. The promise was that investors could finally align their capital with their values. They could prioritize companies that were demonstrably sustainable, fair to their employees, and ethically run. It was meant to be the conscience of the market.
But the sheer scale of the capital that poured into this category is what completely transformed it. I mean, by 2022, global ESG assets were over $40 trillion.
40 trillion. That's roughly 1/3 of all professionally managed money on the planet. When that much capital shifts, it creates an immense profit motive.
And that profit motive exposed the fundamental flaw in the whole system.
Which was the total lack of a standardized, legally binding definition of what sustainable actually means. It created these massive loopholes.
So a company could have terrible environmental practices, emitting millions of tons of CO2.
But still rank very highly on the S for social or G for governance criteria. Maybe they had robust diversity policies or high board independence. This ambiguity allowed fossil fuel giants and major polluters to be included in supposedly green ESG portfolios.
So sustainability became a marketing asset, not a material standard. Companies were essentially buying high ESG ratings to attract all that capital.
And that gave rise to a whole industry of rating agencies selling climate virtue scores. It became a compliance market. A company could just purchase some of those questionable carbon offsets we talked about, which would improve their E-score, allowing them to participate in this huge flow of capital, often without fundamentally changing their core business model at all.
And this connects directly to government policy, doesn't it? Specifically, these huge green stimulus packages like the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA.
Yes. While they are officially aimed at reducing emissions, in practice, they function as highly targeted industrial policy.
Corporate subsidies on a planetary scale.
That's a good way to put it. The IRA provides around $370 billion in incentives. It's not primarily about environmental compliance. It's about offering immense tax credits for manufacturing EVs, producing hydrogen, or building battery plants. It's creating whole new business models that are driven by government funds.
So companies are now designing their entire future operations around how to best optimize these subsidies. But here's the critical transition point for our discussion. Even as the U.S. spends billions trying to create a domestic green supply chain, where do they still have to turn for the physical stuff required for these subsidized factories?
And that is the absolute failure point of the Western approach. The financial and policy interventions, the offsets, the ESG scores, the IRA subsidies, they all address the financial side of this transition. But they don't solve the absolute physical scarcity of the critical inputs you need to actually execute it.
So the IRA is focused on making the final product, the EV or the battery.
But the world's command structure for processing the raw materials is already solidified elsewhere. And that forces us to pivot. We have to move from this speculative casino of crisis to the physical foundation of industrial power.
Okay, so segment 2. The green transition is so often framed as being digital and clean, but beneath that surface, it's built on a massive, dirty, physical shift.
It absolutely is. We are moving the entire global energy engine from liquid fossil fuels that we get from oil wells to solid critical minerals that we have to dig out of mines. We're talking about lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earths.
And this is the defining geopolitical race of the 21st century.
Without a doubt. If the 20th century's weapon was the barrel of crude oil, the 21st century's strategic resource is the metric ton of processed rare earth elements. Whoever controls these materials dictates the speed, the cost, and the direction of the global energy transition.
And the source material we've reviewed is absolutely clear on who has established an undisputed lead in this new extractive empire.
The consolidation of power here is frankly staggering. The data, especially from IEA reports, shows a deep, decades-long strategic commitment to controlling the entire critical mineral value chain.
Not just digging it out of the ground.
No, that's the key. Not just the mining, but the difficult, energy-intensive, and often polluting midstream processing and refining. That is the real choke point.
Let's get into the hard data here, just to understand the magnitude of this dominance.
Okay, so China controls over 90% of the refining capacity for crucial materials like graphite and rare earth elements. You need those for the powerful magnets in every EV motor and every wind turbine.
90%.
Over 90. For lithium and cobalt processing, they handle around 60% of the global volume. And the expansion is targeted and accelerating. Take nickel. China, along with Indonesia, accounted for 90% of all global additions to nickel refining capacity in 2024.
And that number is climbing.
It's climbed rapidly from 83% just 4 years ago. The implication is it's unavoidable.
Yeah.
The entire global clean energy transition runs through supply chains that are commanded by Beijing.
So any Western efforts to try and diversify that supply chain, they're running into this massive industrial headwind. Even if a Western company finds a new lithium deposit in, say, South America or Australia,
the ability to turn that raw ore into battery-grade material simply doesn't exist at scale outside of the established ecosystem. That lack of midstream processing capacity in the West is the primary vulnerability.
why is that? Why is it so hard to build these processing plants?
Because processing critical minerals requires proprietary chemical techniques, massive amounts of energy, and it comes with significant environmental costs. China has been willing to absorb those costs and dedicate state capital to this sector for decades. That, combined with state-backed supply expansion, has led to intense price volatility.
Right. Lithium prices collapsed recently.
They plummeted over 80% from their peak in 2022. That makes building a new non-Chinese processing project economically terrifying for private investors. They can't compete without similar state subsidies, and they face much slower environmental permitting.
This strategic consolidation, then, isn't just about capacity. It's about redefining the very foundations of 21st century power. I saw a report that really brought this to life, focusing on a veteran technician in Baotou. Imagine this landscape. It's not like a traditional mine. It's more like a high-tech fortress of chemical engineering. And this veteran technician, Li, his whole world revolves around proprietary chemical refinement. He's dealing with what they call gray gold, neodymium, and dysprosium.
The key ingredients for high-performance EV motors.
Exactly. And he talks about how decades ago, they used to just ship raw dirt out of the country for minimal profit. But now he's monitoring this complex labyrinth of chemicals, and he can see the entire global economic pulse shifting toward his workshop. His focus isn't on some abstract financial product. It's on the sheer gravity of industrial gravity. He's anchoring the 21st century in this difficult physical processing world.
That story, Lee's story, it perfectly captures the essence of this whole transition. It's a deep commitment to industrial scale over financial abstraction. And that industrial foresight translates directly into market and technological dominance.
The numbers bear that out. Chinese EV and battery firms now command, 68, almost 69% of global EV battery installations.
And it's not just volume anymore. That's the critical shift. They are now arguably leading on technology.
Okay, let's talk about that technological edge. We're moving past just a cost advantage into clear performance superiority.
There are two key areas to look at. First, you have to talk about CATL, Contemporary Amperex Technology. They're the global leader. They've set new benchmarks with things like their 5-minute charging technology.
5 minutes to get a 320-mile range.
Think about that. That solves the single biggest consumer anxiety around EVs, range and charging speed. That's a massive market differentiator. The second area is the widespread adoption of lithium iron phosphate batteries, LFP batteries, which have been championed by BYD.
Now, LFP batteries are significant because they don't use nickel or cobalt, right? They use iron and phosphate, which should make them cheaper and safer.
It does. But this is where the strategic foresight becomes so clear. While LFP reduces the reliance on those high-cost, conflict-prone minerals, it creates entirely new dependencies.
Dependencies that are also tightly controlled.
Precisely. To manufacture LFP batteries, you need purified phosphoric acid. China currently controls 75% of the global market for that essential input. And even when you look to the future, to alternatives like sodium-ion batteries, which just use common salt, China is still dominant. They control 95% of the high-purity manganese sulfate required for that chemistry.
It's a masterful demonstration of looking 3, 4, 5 steps ahead.
It is. And it's all supported by state policies like Made in China 2025, which has the explicit goal of achieving intellectual property leadership in every single element of the green energy stack.
And this industrial mastery is backed up by a global investment strategy that's designed to secure inputs and get around future trade barriers. We've seen Chinese firms invest over $143 billion into foreign ventures since 2014.
It's a very sophisticated dual strategy. Upstream, they go abroad to secure the raw materials. Downstream, they localize manufacturing in key markets.
Why localize?
To bypass potential geopolitical headwinds. Things like the 100% U.S. tariffs or the average 20.8% UU duties. By building factories inside these markets, they embed themselves into the local economies, making their technology indispensable.
Can you give us some concrete examples of this global expansion?
Absolutely. Look at CATL's expansion into Europe. They've established or announced major battery plants in Germany and Hungary. These plants satisfy Europe's demand for local EV production, but they rely entirely on Chinese technology and material processing from the midstream.
And BYD is doing the same?
Yes, building a passenger vehicle plant, also in Hungary, and a new $1 billion factory in Indonesia.
The focus on Southeast Asia seems particularly strategic.
It's a critical frontier. Countries like Indonesia have vast reserves of nickel and cobalt. So by building plants there, like the $6 billion CATL plant in Karawang, they leverage those local mineral resources and also benefit from favorable trade policies within the ASEAN region.
And they form partnerships with Western companies.
That's the final piece. Collaborations, like CATL's with Stellantis in Europe, weave them into the local supply chain fabric. It makes it politically and economically very difficult for Western governments to ever fully decouple. It's an industrial insurance policy against geopolitical risk.
Okay, so that brings us to the final piece of this puzzle. The massive infrastructure required to actually move both the electrons and the people in this new industrial age. This commitment to hard physical infrastructure is often called civilizational efficiency.
A great term for it. It's the tangible ability to integrate a vast economy. And the very first step in achieving that efficiency is securing the energy supply itself. This is the strategic goal of total energy sovereignty.
Decoupling the nation's security and economic health from reliance on volatile, Western-dominated global oil and gas markets.
And this relies on these massive infrastructure commitments to harness their own domestic renewable resources.
This is where China's deployment of ultra-high voltage power grids comes in. It's a massive shift toward energy sovereignty, and we get an incredible perspective on this ambition through the eyes of an engineer out in the Gobi Desert.
A truly massive project.
I read this account of an engineer, Zhang, stationed at a colossal converter station deep in the Gobi. You have to try and visualize this. Thousands of miles of just desolation. And then it's interrupted by these massive humming towers of an ultra-high voltage grid, the UHV grid.
It's hard to even imagine the scale.
And Zhang's mission is the operational reality of energy independence. He has to ensure that all the wind and sun harvested in the West can efficiently power the skyscrapers and the factories thousands of miles away on the coast. He sees every kilowatt hour sent eastward as a victory over the old order of vulnerable oil tankers and blocked maritime straits. For him and his colleagues, they aren't just managing a grid. They are building the nervous system of national strategic security.
And what Zhang is working on, the UHV grid, it's a strategic feat of engineering that fundamentally redefines the economics of renewables. It relies on high-voltage direct current technology, HVDC. This is the key.
Why is that so important?
Because conventional alternating current, AC transmission, which is what most grids use, loses a significant amount of energy over long distances. You can lose up to 40% of the power when you transmit it over 1,000 kilometers.
So what's the advantage of HVDC?
HVDC minimizes that energy loss. It can reduce it to just 3 to 5% for a transmission across 2,000 kilometers or more. This is what makes those massive solar and wind farms they're building in remote Western regions, like the Gobi, economically viable for the big population centers in the East.
It connects the resource to the demand.
It transforms geographically distant renewable sources into a reliable, integrated source of national power. It's the backbone of energy sovereignty.
And the numbers that illustrate this capacity are they're staggering.
They're installing renewables at a pace the world has never seen. By the end of 2024, the total installed renewable capacity hit 1,878 gigawatts. To put that in context, in 2024 alone, they installed over 373 gigawatts of new wind and solar.
More than the rest of the world combined.
More than the rest of the world combined in a single year. By August of 2025, their total installed non-fossil fuel capacity officially surpassed their fossil fuel capacity. This scale, combined with that UHV backbone, means national security is being progressively decoupled from the volatility of imported fossil fuels.
And that same industrial logic of efficiency and integration that's driving the UHV grid, it's just as powerfully expressed in their high-speed rail network.
Yes, the commitment to redefining mobility on a massive scale.
I saw this clip about a designer in Chengdu, a woman named Chen, who's working on the next generation of high-speed rail components. And her team's internal metric of success, it isn't stock valuation or some abstract ESG score.
It's civilizational efficiency.
That's the term they use. It's defined by tangible output. The report said that for her team, if a patent doesn't result in a faster train component or a more efficient green hydrogen electrolyzer within 18 months, they consider it a failure. Her focus is absolute physical industrial output.
In that perspective, prioritizing tangible metrics like patent-to-market conversion rates is establishing a new global benchmark. It favors physical industrial output over the speculative financialization of climate risk. And the HSR network itself is the ultimate expression of this commitment.
Integrating these vast labor markets, boosting productivity across huge distances.
The scale of the network is there's no comparison globally.
What are the numbers on that?
By 2025, the operational length of the high-speed rail network reached 50,000 kilometers. That accounts for roughly 2/3 of the world's total. And they've radically accelerated their own plans. The initial blueprint called for 12,000 kilometers by 2020.
So they've blown past their own targets. How did they achieve that?
Through a sustained, very clear strategy. They started with licensed foreign designs from companies like Siemens and Kawasaki. But then they rapidly localized the technology to develop their own indigenous systems, which culminated in the Fuxinghao train franchise.
And these trains operated speeds up to 350 kilometers an hour on dedicated lines. We're not just talking about top speed, but sustained speed.
The Beijing-Shanghai HSR Express service, for instance, averages 291.9 kilometers per hour. That's the fastest average commercial service in the world. And they're not stopping there. The innovation is constant.
This is where the maglev comes in.
Yes, in July 2025, the state-owned CRRC officially unveiled a 600-kilometer-per-hour high-speed maglev train. This is a strategic move. It's designed to bridge the travel time gap between conventional high-speed rail and commercial air travel.
600 kilometers an hour. That's transformative. That could cut the 1,300-kilometer journey between Beijing and Shanghai from about 5 hours down to roughly 2.5.
Fundamentally challenging domestic air travel. And this technological leap is being aggressively exported. The opening of the Whoosh line in Indonesia, connecting Jakarta and Bandung in 2023, that was a critical geopolitical marker.
Why was that so significant?
Because it represents the first complete export of the entire system. The design, the construction, the rolling stock, the operational model, all of it, to Southeast Asia. They are exporting a complete blueprint for it's almost entirely the convenience factor. The train stations are centrally located in cities, not miles outside. And the security procedures are significantly quicker than at an airport. A passenger saves, on average, 35 to 45 minutes of total travel time compared to flying the same distance.
This must have had a dramatic impact on the domestic airline industry.
It's been incredibly disruptive. Aviation research shows a clear structural decline in short-haul flights. Domestic flights of 800 kilometers or less plummeted from over 26% of all domestic flights in 2011 and under 16% in early 2025.
So it's forcing the airlines to completely rethink their business.
They have to. They're abandoning shorter routes and shifting their capacity to longer domestic and international routes. It's restructuring the entire national transportation market.
And beyond just competing with air travel, what are the broader economic goals here?
The economic goals are central. The HSR is designed to support regional integration. It effectively links the major economic hubs with secondary cities, which expands labor markets and boosts overall national productivity. And crucially, from an energy perspective, it reinforces the decoupling strategy.
How so?
Electric locomotives consume significantly less energy per passenger kilometer than cars or planes. And because they draw their power from that UHV-backed grid, which is increasingly supplied by domestic renewable energy, the entire transport system reinforces the goal of energy sovereignty and efficiency. At the end of the day, the hard physical commitment to infrastructure is the bedrock of future economic and strategic power.
So we've concluded our deep dive, and we've seen these two parallel universes really emerge from the climate crisis. Two very different yet equally determined approaches to the future.
There really are two different worlds.
On one side, you have this highly sophisticated financial system that has found ways to adapt, to repackage, and ultimately to sell protection from environmental chaos. This is the monetization of fear through products like catastrophe bonds, those porous carbon credits, and the massive, often loophole-ridden umbrella of ESG branding.
And what's become clear is that the market doesn't necessarily need to solve the problem.
No, it just needs the crisis to remain profitable, to stay manageable as a financial hedge.
And then on the other side, we've detailed the rise of this new industrial power, focused so intensely on tangible metrics and absolute physical capacity. It's a cold, hard relocation to the world's engine room.
Built on a methodical strategy of securing absolute control over those critical mineral supply chains, mastering high-tech manufacturing in the EV ecosystem,
and deploying massive, state-of-the-art infrastructure. Things like that highly efficient UHV grid and the world's longest high-speed rail network.
So what this deep dive really reveals, I think, is that the global climate narrative is far less about a singular moral mission and far more about who controls the next energy monopoly.
And how that control is exercised. Is it through trading financial derivatives that are betting on future damage? Or is it through commanding the physical supply chain of lithium, of electrons, and of the means of global mobility?
The contrast is just so stark.
It is. The most salient contrast is between those who are focused on selling the hedge against the world's survival as a premium financial product, and those who are focused on building a new physical reality based on measurable industrial output and civilizational efficiency. The materials change, from coal and oil to lithium and electrons, but the foundational strategy of consolidating resource control, industrial capacity, and sovereign efficiency remains the ultimate key to global power.